Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Melissa Bailey Nihei. I'm Program Development Associate here at the National Japanese American Historical Society. Welcome to our second online program for this month, Book Talk with Professor Gail Okawa on her latest book, Our Grandfathers Exile. Next, I'd like to quickly introduce our Executive Director here at Ninjas, Rosalind Tonai, who will introduce Professor Okawa. Rosalind?
Hi, welcome everyone. And I guess we're waiting for Gail to come on screen. Thank you for joining us today. We have a wonderful presentation. And there's Gail. Hi, Dr. Okawa. How are you?
Hi.
Joining us? I'm going to do a quick, brief introduction of you and we can get started.
Okay.
Dr. Gail Okawa is a visiting scholar at the Center for Biographical Research, the University of Hawaii in Mānoa, and Professor Emerita of English at Youngstown State University in Ohio. She's interested in the links between language, literacy, culture, identity, and race in relation to history, social justice, and education, and has published numerous articles in national journals and collections, as well as presented papers and lectures nationally and internationally. Since 2002, when she was a visiting scholar at the Smithsonian Institution, she had been exploring the experiences of Japanese immigrants from Hawaii, including her maternal grandfather, who was imprisoned during World War II in the U.S. Department of Justice and War Department internment camps on the U.S. mainland. Her project expanded to describe the visits and losses of sons in the U.S. military among internee fathers, and to record memories of the Santa Fe internment camp among the city's present-day residents. Her recently published book, Remembering Our Grandfathers Exile, is a culmination of an 18-year odyssey. So without further ado, Dr. Gail Okawa.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Many thanks to Grant Din and Rosalind Tonai for inviting me to share my book with you, to the National Japanese American Historical Society and Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation for co-sponsoring this event, and to UH Press for publishing my book. To begin, please allow me to share a point of ignorance and read from an early page of my book. I didn't know that my maternal grandfather, Tamasaku Watanabe, was absent, and don't remember exactly where he appeared in my life, a tall, quiet, almost austere man, a Christian minister who was a physical presence just once or twice a year when he came to visit us in Honolulu from the island of Maui. When I was in high school in Honolulu, I first learned from a family friend who lived on our block that this grandfather had been imprisoned in an American concentration camp on the mainland during World War II. I had just learned about the imprisonment of American Japanese in my American history class as something that happened on the West Coast, and perhaps we were talking about it when she mentioned this. I was stunned. My family had never talked about my grandfather's internment, and neither had he. I rushed home to question my parents and remember them confirming this. He came back a changed man, they both agreed. It seemed to be a closed subject at that point, at least for kids, and I don't remember pursuing it. It wasn't until decades later in the 1990s and years after my grandfather's death that I found this one lone photo among his internment papers, carefully stored in an old trunk. My mother recognized her father in the third row, but the location was quite a mystery. I had some suspicions due to the vigas that I'd seen in New Mexico, these protrusions here. In the early 2000s, I finally had a chance to research what happened to him. So my book, Remembering Our Grandfathers Exile, is a story of several journeys. First, how my search for what happened to one man expanded to many other Issei men, a separate and complicated story which I can only allude to here. And second, what I learned about their many uncommon and common journeys. My research started with my grandfather, who had developed deep California ties. Like so many immigrants, Tamasaku Watanabe had chosen to leave his village in Hiroshima for San Francisco via Seattle in 1902 at age 22. He was baptized as a Christian there and served as the secretary of the Japanese YMCA. Precursor, as I understand, to the Japanese Presbyterian Church. Witnessing the devastation of the great San Francisco earthquake, he had been inspired to enter the San Francisco Theological Seminary to formally join the Christian ministry. He married and started a family in California. First served at the Japanese Presbyterian Church in Stockton, then at the Japanese Church of Christ in Sacramento. But in the early 1920s, he decided to answer the call to serve as an evangelist in the Hawaiian Islands. In October 1922, when the family was preparing to leave for Hawaii, their youngest child was killed in an accident with an oil truck. Although grieving for this loss, Reverend Watanabe packed up his family, my grandmother and 3 children, and they made the difficult trip across the ocean a few weeks later. He was first assigned to the island of Maui, where he served the Wailuku Japanese Christian Church members for 12 years. Here he is. I hope you can see him smiling in the back row, in the top row. Then transferred to the island of Hawaii, the Big Island, to serve plantation workers in Ola on the Hilo side of the island. As an ordained minister, he attended professional meetings. It was at his parsonage at the Ola Japanese Christian Church that he was seized on December 7th, 1941. While doing months of research in the National Archives, I found 5 record group files on Reverend Watanabe, containing scores of World War II documents. And these record group numbers here on the left-hand side might be useful for anyone who in the audience interested in pursuing their own family research. You can see the record group number 85 for the INS. There was a file that changed numbers to 494, the Office of the Military Government, since Hawaii was under martial law. The Department of Justice file RG 60, and the Office of the Provost Marshal General had 2 files in RG 389. For example, this photo from the Santa Fe internment camp pictures a group of Hawaii Issei. As I pieced stories together, I figured out that this photo was of internees on transfer boat 3 because it was unlabeled. From various parts of Japan, they also had chosen to make the trip across the ocean, had lives, families, and occupations. For example, Reverend Fujitani here was a Buddhist priest. Reverend Ikuma was a Shinto priest. Mr. Kinoshita was a plantation worker and also a leader in the PTA for his children. Mr. Kato was a coffee farmer. Mr. Kawasaki was an attorney. Mr. Shigenaga was a businessman. Mr. Ohama and Mr. Mizutari were both Japanese school principals. And then there was my grandfather, who was a Christian minister. So this group represents quite a span of different Issei with different occupations. But due to anti-Japanese immigration laws and attitudes, Japanese immigrants were outlawed from US citizenship and remained aliens. On December 7th, 1941, that day of many infamies, many Japanese men in Hawaii, like my grandfather, were suddenly arrested and taken from their families. The government, the FBI, which was part of the Department of Justice, in collaboration with the US Army, targeted mainly community leaders in Hawaii, then imprisoned and exiled nearly 700 of them to the mainland, which is a long story in my book. These are fathers and grandfathers, some of whom I've written about. How did this happen? When war was declared with Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor, their immigration status changed instantly to alien enemy, which, as I said, is an immigration status. Some of you undoubtedly know that this happened with Issei men from the mainland as well. Fathers and grandfathers disappeared beginning on December 7th, 1941, over 2 months before EO 9066. The FBI had lists and files. My grandfather was arrested in his parsonage on that Sunday morning. We have no other details. We can only imagine how shocking and humiliating it was for him. But we do have the warrant for his arrest, which, interestingly enough, says that he was arrested on suspicion of being an alien enemy of the United States. As I mentioned before, that was simply an immigration status. It's not a crime. Mr. Otani, who was a businessman, was arrested in his yukata, his bathrobe. He had immigrated from a fishing village in Japan when he was 18 and had developed a good business in Honolulu. He had also developed a heart condition and wasn't well in midlife. But on December 7th, the FBI and military came to his home, his son Akira told me. The agent pointed a gun at him, pulled him roughly to his feet, and began to shove him into the car without allowing him to change his clothes. Fortunately, his wife threw his coat and shoes into the car before they drove off. Reverend Kenjo Ohara was a young Buddhist priest and almost got missed because he wasn't on the FBI's list. When authorities came to arrest the head priest at his temple on Hawaii Island, they made a note of his presence and returned later to arrest him in January. Iso Kato, the coffee farmer on Hawaii Island, whom I introduced you to, describes his later arrest on February 22nd, 1942, when he was informed by his 16-year-old son that the police had come for him, and he had to say goodbye to his very young children. At 8 a.m., I was tending the garden when Chiaki came running. "The police officer has come," he blurted out. He seemed worried that I might be arrested. I told him not to worry, as I had done nothing wrong. I asked him to help Mother stay strong and not be disheartened. I encouraged him to keep up the work on the coffee farm. Chiaki looked helpless, but agreed. The officer formally asked my name, searched me for unlawful possessions, and ordered me to get ready as he was taking me to the marshal, and that I was not to take anything with me. I was ordered to speak only in English. Haruko, his young daughter, carried Nobuko, and Toshiko was in Chiaki's arms. Shigeo was half crying. I reached out and clasped each child's hand in silent farewell. Kato, like my grandfather and Reverend Ohara, was detained at the Kilauea military camp with other Hawaii Island Issei. And we're very thankful to George Hoshida for his sketches that tell the entire story of the internment. Prisoners were given hearings, so-called hearings. The one for Reverend Fujitani, the Buddhist priest, was relatively short, a 5-page transcript. The questions were informational, seemed pro forma. For Reverend Watanabe, being both Japanese and a Christian, seemed to raise questions among his interrogators, who apparently had doubts that a Japanese could be a Christian. His transcript was double the length of Reverend Fujitani's. On the subject of war, the interrogator tried to force him to take sides, and he answered in his halting English instead of using an interpreter. I won't be able to read this due to time constraints, but suffice it to say, the interrogator repeatedly insisted that Reverend Watanabe choose countries, then later admitted, maybe it's not a fair question. The hearing board, or interrogators, concluded 1, that the internee is a subject of Japan, 2, that the internee owes allegiance to Japan, and 3, that the internee's activities have been pro-Japanese, though not necessarily anti-American. And they voted 3-1 for his release. But he was sent to the Honolulu Immigration Station, where they took his mugshot. He was 59. Then sent him to the Sand Island internment camp, where the order for release was reversed by the Intelligence Board. You can see the signatures of the Army and Navy intelligence officers and the FBI agent as well. And if you notice at the very bottom of the screen, you can see that it says, it appearing necessary, it is ordered that Tamasaku Watanabe be interned. As an English teacher, the use of the passive voice is very interesting to me. So he and hundreds of other Hawaii Issei were interned, not for specific wrongdoing, but, quote, it appearing necessary, unquote. Then they were exiled. Due to convoluted political reasons, nearly 700 prisoners were shipped to the mainland, sent on 10 transfer boats at different times from the islands, beginning on February 20th, 1942. And these maps document their exile from their families and homes. I identified 4 routes. You can see that their entry point was Angel Island and Fort McDowell. The first group was sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, then to Camp Forest, Tennessee, and to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. Some people were sent eventually to Fort Missoula, Montana, and then to Santa Fe. Others were sent directly from Camp Livingston to Santa Fe. The second transfer boat went from Angel Island all the way to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, then to Camp Livingston. And again, some were sent to Fort Missoula and some were sent to Santa Fe. The third transfer boat, on which my grandfather and the other men I showed you entered at Angel Island, then were sent to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, then to Camp Lordsburg and Santa Fe internment camp in New Mexico. So my grandfather with these men then went on that third route and sailed on May 23rd, 1942. My grandfather's itinerary confirms the different stops along the way here. So from Sand Island to Angel Island to Fort Sam Houston to Lordsburg to Santa Fe. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time with Angel Island because of our audience. In his journal, Mr. Kato, the coffee farmer, who I introduced earlier, describes their ship dropping anchor on June 1st, 1942, near what he calls the world-renowned Golden Gate Bridge. He calls it a thing of beauty and describes it in detail, while George Hoshida, who accompanied him, terms it, quote, a thrilling sight, a refreshing treat after the long, miserable voyage, unquote. And I'll read you more from my book on this. Kato reports being taken by a small boat to Angel Island, where they followed in the footsteps of thousands of Asian immigrants entering the United States. But now we're greeted by, quote, dozens of bayoneted guards, unquote, standing on either side of them. And he goes on. We headed for the immigration center up a hill. An iron gate opened and we filed into a room. I heard the steel gate clang shut and locked. Again, we were stripped naked and put through another inspection. When will this ever end, I wondered. And I wondered how my grandfather, in his 59th year, endured this indignity. I also wondered how he felt returning to San Francisco, a prisoner, when he had left California for Hawaii with his young family in 1922, a free man, looking forward to his third ministry in the islands. And this continues in the book. Despite the initial strip search, the discomfort of 109 of them crowded into two rooms, Kato writes of humane experiences as well. Quote, it is different here from Hawaii in that we are enjoying more privileges. We are free to bathe and use the toilet at any time. All accommodations are comfortable. The dining room is new and the food preparation is sanitary and tasty. The cook and kitchen helpers are all military men, and they treat us kindly. The beauty of the island itself was not lost on these men. Kato's description of Angel Island allows us to imagine it in May and allows me to imagine what my grandfather saw as they arrived together. It is, quote, a small mountain. Down to the foot of the mountain, it is lush and green with trees. There are pine trees, cherry-like trees, and other deciduous trees. Small chirping birds are plentiful, unquote. Hoshida observes, quote, a tiny hummingbird for the first time with its blurring wings. It darted among the branches, stopping motionless for a few seconds at some flowers. And Matsujiro Otani, the businessman arrested in his yukata, who arrived on the 4th transfer boat in June, also appreciated this, quote, beautiful island within San Francisco harbor. Flowers were in bloom, birds were singing, and it was a small island like heaven. But they were prisoners after all. So anxious were some prisoners to express themselves, to record their transient presence in that place, that they carved inscriptions into the immigration station walls. Scholar Charles Egan, whom you heard last week, has reproduced and translated these inscriptions. Takuji Shindo, for one, a druggist from Hilo, Hawaii, arrived at Angel Island on the same transfer boat as Kato, Hoshida, and my grandfather, and simply wrote, June 4th, as a prisoner, Hilo City, Shindo. Another internee, possibly also on transfer boat 3, inscribed a more poignant message anonymously. Evening, the expectation that one day will bring escape, cold, bleak, June 4th. They were sent by train that very day to Fort Sam Houston, an army camp, where they were intense with over 100-degree heat for 10 days. Then transferred to Lordsburg, another army camp. And we have no photos of the camp itself, but we do have George Hoshida's sketches, where they were for a year, First, under the harsh treatment of a lieutenant colonel named Lundy, who ignored many internee rights dictated by the Geneva Convention. And I discuss this at some length in my book. But due to the internees assertively advocating for their rights, stories involving Genji Mihara of Seattle, Reverend Yoshiaki Fukuda of San Francisco, and Kango Kawasaki, the attorney from Hilo, I introduced you to. Lundy was replaced by a more reasonable camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Ledbetter. It was here that Reverend Fukuda, a Konkokyo minister, my grandfather, a Christian minister, and Reverend Hosho Kurohira, a Buddhist priest, submitted a multi-faith petition that redefined the concept of family to be culturally sensitive, influencing who would be allowed at the family internment camp at Crystal City, Texas. In June of 1943, Issei internees were transferred to Santa Fe by train. And I verified the location and content of my grandfather's mystery photo. This was Barrack 64. I'm sure it's not everyone in the barrack, but anyway, my grandfather with several of his fellow prisoners. Over 4,500 Japanese men were imprisoned at different times and for different durations at the Santa Fe detention internment camp, run by the INS under the Department of Justice from March 1942 until the camp was closed in 1946. The majority of Hawaii Issei were moved there in June 1943 from Army camps like Lordsburg and Camp Livingston in Louisiana. In my book, I describe the internees' lives in these different prison camps based on Issei journals, letters, archival documents, photos, and so on. To give you some insight into their lives, I thought I'd share some of their experiences with letter writing, since it was a critical lifeline for them, as well as their suffering as prisoners and how many chose to deal with it. Letter writing, especially in the early days of internment, when suspicion was high and restrictions were many, was fraught with problems for many Japanese immigrants because of language issues. A mandate in the Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed participating countries like the US, clearly states, quote, with respect to contact with the outside world during their captivity, individuals must be allowed to send and receive letters and postcards in their native language. But whether authorities followed the law was another matter. Mr. Kato remembers letter writing rules and language problems experienced by the Japanese immigrant prisoners. We spend free time writing diaries or letters to families, he writes. We are allowed letters only to and from families and relatives and written only in English. Restrictions are numerous, such as there should be no mention of names or numbers of people, and definitely nothing about our prison conditions to the outside world. Any violation meant confiscation of the letter or censorship, or sometimes being returned to the sender to be rewritten. Letters after being received and read cannot be kept in our hands, but must be submitted to them. No books or printed material was allowed, and absolutely no Japanese word should be used in letters. They were especially strict about that. After receiving a precious letter from his family, Kato continues, last night my mind was filled with thoughts of my family. I could not sleep. Today I am anxious to write a reply. I sit prepared with paper and pen and wait for my friend to write for me when he's free. I could easily express my thoughts in Japanese, but an important letter such as this to be written for me by someone else is frustrating and painful. My friend is kind and he writes for me, He is thorough and asks for clarification. With mustered courage, I tell him what I can, but it is not what I truly feel. Conversely, from that friend's view, George Hoshida, who arrived in Hawaii as a 4-year-old and was bilingual, writes from Lordsburg on 14th September 1942 of his task as writer, interpreter, translator of others' thoughts and words. Had changed ink for my pen today, there's a little history behind it. The black ink which I had been using was purchased at Texas Sam Houston internment camp a couple of days after reaching there by Mr. Kagawa. He had given custody of the ink in my hands for me to help people correspond with their families. It has served us very well until yesterday. There is a bit left, perhaps enough for 2 or 3 fillings at my desk in our barrack. I've written a lot of letters with it for myself and others, perhaps more for others, because letters had to be written in English, and practically all the people in the barrack couldn't write in English. I also had to read and interpret their letters from home. The letters to their families must have gladdened the hearts of many when they received the papers, which the ink had turned into affectionate letters. These letters have traveled for thousands of miles, and if they were alive, what stories of joys, sorrows, and longings they could have revealed. A bottle of ink, just 10 cents in money, but its work cannot be figured in money. It has carried messages from hearts to hearts and created emotions which cannot be fathomed materially. Eventually, the US government followed the Geneva Convention mandate and lifted restrictions on internees using their native language, so the Katos were able to communicate in Japanese. But letters were more or less censored. Censorship, in addition to slow mail, must have added to the anxiety of internees, especially those who had families in crisis. Reverend Matsuda, a Zen Buddhist priest with a wife and young baby, was a prolific letter writer. Because of slow mail service or letters being rejected or being returned by censors, Reverend Matsuda had to rewrite a letter in December 1942 that he had written in November from Camp Livingston, Louisiana. A letter concerning his wife's health. You can see it's still censored. One scholar points out, quote, not only were words, phrases, sentences, and even whole paragraphs excised from both incoming and outgoing letters, but also the mere presence of the censor inhibited letter writers who practiced self-censorship to avoid the possibility that their correspondence would not be forwarded or that they would lose their letter writing privileges altogether. So letter writing potentially brought both joy and suffering to many internees. Regarding outright mistreatment, Professor Tetsuden Kashima, author of Judgment Without Trial, verifies that mainland residents, quote, received particularly harsh treatment, including severe physical abuse and solitary confinement at Fort Missoula in the early months of the war, unquote. The Hawaii Japanese prisoners experienced fear of death, strip searches, isolation, humiliation, shootings at Fort Sill and Lordsburg, stabbings, and psychological manipulation. In his memoir, Mr. Otani, the businessman introduced earlier, describes what I call the Father's Day incident, the deception involved in the departure of the 4th transfer boat from Sand Island on 21st June, a few weeks after Kato and my grandfather left Honolulu in May. He writes, at 6 a.m., we were ordered to line up in a row and roll call was taken. Captain Eifler came in and said, quote, we have good news for you. Tomorrow is Father's Day, and so you will be able to meet your loved ones, your wives, your parents, and your children. So you should wear your best clothes and greet them with a smile. We were overjoyed and that we would be able to meet our family the next day. So from the previous day, we shaved. We prepared ourselves. The following 21st day, the designated hour was 1 p.m. We were all deciding what we would say to our families, and we anxiously waited for the hour. It was 1 o'clock, then 2 o'clock, then 3 o'clock, but no family member appeared. We waited most anxiously. We had lost hope, and it was already 4 o'clock. What came was the order for us to relocate to the US mainland. The order was that we would leave at 4:20, so we had to prepare for it. Receiving this opposite news, we were all disheartened, but because it was war, we could do nothing about it. At 4:30, we were put on a small boat from Sand Island. We were sent to the US mainland on a military ship, but we were not allowed to go on the deck. We could not look at the island of Oahu, nor could we express our feelings about departure. Fortunately, Mr. Otani and his fellow prisoners were greeted at Lordsburg by the internees on Transfer Boat 3, which included my grandfather, Kato Hoshida, and others, who were among the first arrivals at that camp. Internee deaths at the hands of soldiers caused further anguish, anxiety, and fear. There was the shooting of Kanesaburo Oshima of Hawaii Island at Fort Sill. And then at Lordsburg, there was an infamous and controversial shooting in July 1942 of two California Issei, Mr. Kobata and Mr. Isomura, who were ill and separated from the main group of arrivals, who were shot allegedly trying to escape. Mr. Kawasaki, as a civilian internee leader, expressed the condolences of the men in Company 5 at the prisoner services for Kobata and Isomura on August 2nd, 1942. Rather than speaking to the attendees in the audience, he presumably faced and addressed the deceased with the following poignant and telling words in Japanese. Our two brothers who arrived at this camp from North Dakota, ailing in poor health, and who didn't even have the opportunity to become acquainted with the other internees here, sadly disappeared from the earth along with the desert dew. It is to be regretted to the utmost. The authorities tried to justify their action and claimed that they shot you because you tried to escape when told to stop, but that you, who were seriously ill, could have escaped is questionable. Common sense prevents us from believing so. Unfortunately, there was not a single eyewitness, and the incident was buried exactly as the authorities claimed. On Judgment Day, the person responsible will surely receive his due. Although we are utter strangers to you, we of Company 5 send you our utmost sincere condolences. We wish that you would accept them. Many Hawaii internees had sons who were drafted into the US military or who volunteered. 161 internees with 210 sons. This is another cause of anxiety and great anguish when they were wounded or killed in action. This is another long and poignant story in my book. Perhaps the subject of another talk. But trauma took different forms. Members of the second transfer boat were sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Otokichi Ozaki, a journalist, describes the physical conditions at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which took a psychological toll. Here at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where glittering heat waves rise and peak as far as the eye can see, the jumbled sound of machines and hammers can be heard, triggered apparently by the sudden need for more barracks. There's not a tree to be seen. Tents stand in rows, the heat, as though the wind is dead. No soap rations, no toothpaste, no hair oil for the past 2 months. What money we had was taken from us, so we have none. We become irritable. Eat, sleep, wake up. Eat, sleep, wake up. A life cut off from everything in the world. The unbearable monotony of a life without variation seems to slowly warp our minds. The crazy weather and the tent life, one cannot help but begin to lose one's mind. Are we not becoming like leaking balloons, ambitionless, lethargic, and apathetic? I want to note, however, that the prisoners from Hawaii and others did everything they could to survive and resist that mind-numbing monotony that Ozaki describes, and another referred to as barbed wire disease. This is how he describes it. It has been said that an internee is most likely to succumb to the discouragement and depression known as barbed wire disease. To keep myself out of the disease, I'm participating in many activities at this camp. So to understand those many activities, I borrowed a template of a psychologist named John Laffin, who describes how long-term captives often employ universal human strategies to cope with the deprivation of freedom and the malaise of boredom. Strategies that the internees adapted to their culture and practices as Hawaii Japanese. You can see here the physically creative, the physically active, the intellectual, and the imaginative, and I added the spiritual the spiritual and ritual strategy due to the many photos I found of smaller and large group gatherings. I thought this was very significant to the Japanese prisoners. There were photos of Japanese men and so on. So I will show you some examples. The strategies for the physically creative strategy involved painting, sketching, and so on. Mr. Hoshida, of course, well known for his drawings and sketches of camp life. Mr. Matsumoto, whom I was able to interview, he was 100 years old at the time. Actually did this amazing craft work where in Louisiana, they had longleaf pine needles and he was able to braid them, flatten them, and then stitch them together into purses such as these. This actually is the size of a small briefcase. The physically active strategy, of course, was very popular. They actually engaged in sumo for special occasions, but baseball and theater performances were very popular. Here's Mr. Matsumoto with a baseball team, probably from Camp Missoula, and Mr. Miho, also both baseball players. And Mr. Matsumoto also enjoyed the theater and participated as an onagata or played the part of a woman, as was characteristic of Japanese theater. Here he is in plain clothes. Of course, the intellectual strategy was among the most popular. You have letter writing, also the writing of memoirs, journals, so on. Example of a postcard from Reverend Matsuda. This is the kind of stationery that the internees were allowed. Reverend Odate's journal. Mr. Kato's journal, Mr. Kawasaki's scrapbook, which contained typewritten material. He was one of the leaders of the internee community. So he's very efficient. Among the intellectual strategies, I found that petition writing was very, very impressive, considering that aliens were not citizens, and petitions were the right of citizens and citizenship. But this petition was signed by Mr. Shigenaga as the main signatory, and over close to 200, around 200 internees. And here is the signature of my grandfather and probably a number of his barrack mates. So I suspect that they went from barrack to barrack for the signatures. So I mentioned this, the spiritual and ritual services were very common and were very interfaith in terms of the attendees. Here you have a Tenrikyo memorial service, hundreds of men, and it also gives you a nice idea of the landscape, the kinds of buildings. This was a theater that the internees constructed. This was a Christian funeral. Again, men of many different faiths attended. And this is an iconic photo of the funeral for Mizo Nishizaki, attended by his soldier son. Clearly a Buddhist funeral with all of the Buddhist priests in the front. But the imaginative strategy involving poetry and calligraphy and the writing of plays was also very important to the internees. Some enjoy, poetry writing especially was a favorite pastime for some of the internees before the war, like Reverend Odate here, and who was a Buddhist priest and was a writer of haiku. Mr. Soga, a journalist, and others wrote tanka, the 5-line Japanese poem. And they continued the practice in the camps. And these men published their work and others in collections such as Kodama. Such publications were a testimony to their long-term purpose, one that transcended the boundaries of the Santa Fe internment camp's barbed wire. Soga clearly states the purposes of this collection to be both cultural and political, and for posterity. After the onset of World War II, from Alaska in the north to Hawaii in the south, Japanese men from all stations and walks of life were incarcerated in this camp in Santa Fe. Although we are from different backgrounds and situations, we are alike in that we have been forced to abandon our homes, leave our families, and experience the trauma and indignity of living in a prison camp. The Literary Society of Santa Fe Bungei Kyokai, was born in this harsh environment and circumstances. We have bonded in a unique way to express ourselves in poetry. The publication of this anthology, Kodama, is a demonstration to the world and future generations to come of the true Japanese spirit of Yamato Damashi, the strong Japanese character of calm in the face of unbearably harsh adversity. It is our hope that this effort will help to establish a peaceful world for future generations. So these were educated and highly literate men who made every effort to maintain their cultural identities and forms principally and deliberately through language, to maintain their integrity and dignity. Some Hawaii internees who had sons in the US military returned to Hawaii in July 1945, before the war ended. But most of them who were still in Santa Fe, including Reverend Watanabe and some of these same men on Transfer Boat 3, left on October 30th for Seattle, Washington by train and were shipped back to Hawaii from Seattle on a military transport in November 1945, 3 months after the war ended. I learned long after their deaths that my grandmother had made the comment that my grandfather was a changed man when he returned. So although he resumed his job, his ministry, it'll remain a mystery to me how he was personally before he was imprisoned and how he had changed. Not until 1988, long after my grandfather and many of his fellow internees were gone, did the US exonerate the American Japanese and apologize for the injustice done to them during World War II. That only happened, of course, thanks to the tenacity and legal activism of their children and grandchildren. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed by President Ronald Reagan on August 10th, 1988, set forth carefully worded language. And I won't read this to you, but I did want to point out that this says that there were no acts of espionage or sabotage, and the internment was motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. As much as the thousands of Issei and their American Japanese families wanted to forget those war years in order to survive and move on, something that most of them did do. This raises questions of remembering and forgetting, expressed also by Mr. Soga in this poem, written during his internment. When the war is over and after we are gone, who will visit this lonely grave in the wild where my friend lies buried? Who will remember him, them, their imprisoned presence, and how? In Santa Fe, the internment camp has been replaced by Casa Solana, a post-war subdivision of middle class and upper middle class homes. No apparent remains of the camp, but in the late 1990s, a committee of descendants and concerned residents proposed erecting a historical marker to memorialize the existence of the camp and the thousands of American Japanese residents imprisoned there. In 2002, I attended the dedication of the Santa Fe internment camp marker, which had provoked an extraordinary controversy as well as a victory of understanding among Santa Fe residents. And 5 years into my book research, I made a pilgrimage to the marker and made another discovery. Through her granddaughter, Lisa, whom I met at an academic conference, I met Lucia Ortiz Trujillo from Santa Fe. She had a childhood memory of the Japanese men being brought to Santa Fe by train because she remembered the candy bars that they threw to the kids playing near the train station. Her granddaughter also wrote, she remembers walking around with the same kids all the time. And when they were in the area that is now called Casa Solana, they'd walk near the camp and see all the guards and fences and people inside. She said if it wasn't for the candy, she might not even remember any of it. So as I wrote in my book, this made me wonder, could one of the people they saw inside the fences have been my grandfather? Lucy Trujillo's story made me realize the value of the memories of those who lived outside the barbed wire, who may have chanced by the camp or peered in, who were there at the same real time as my grandfather and the hundreds of other Hawaii men. I searched for others with memories, and in the process of gathering stories, I met the Jesus Rios family. They had for over 80 years, run the Rios Woodyard, which I've come to understand is a kind of institution in Santa Fe. Rodolfo, born in 1939, had clear memories of growing up in the presence of the Santa Fe internment camp. This is what he said to me. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my dad would tell us about the prisoners that were on Casa Solana. We'd pass by it to deliver a lot of wood further down. All of that was empty. We could see the high fences, and my dad would drive slow and try to explain as best he could to a child what was going on. I thought they had them in there gardening because they were gardening. Some of them were kneeling down and working the dirt, and to me, they looked like children because they were smaller people. And I asked my dad, what are they doing to those kids? He said, they're not kids, they're men. But what did the men do? What did they do? My dad said they didn't do anything. The government picked them up because they're supposedly not American. They're afraid that they'll help Japan. Without even knowing, they just brought them here. When you're very young, you don't expect your government to be doing this either. They hadn't done wrong, but since they were of another race, they brought them in without charging them, with anything, herded them up like cattle and brought them here. My dad would try to explain that they're human beings, just like us, but the war is against their nation. It was a sad time. After the Japanese left, we worked there. The lumberyard was delivering building material, and I was already in my 20s, 25. And the picture came back. The dirt was rich right there. You could see why they were planting whatever they were planting, because the ground was black, rich, very rich. Comes back. It still does. When I pass through there, I tell my kids now, they had the Japanese Americans right there. They brought them in like cattle and put them in there. I can still see where the encampment was. I can see it mentally. What stayed in my mind most were the men working, and you'd see them from far away. And Lucy told me a few years ago, that when she visits her sister's house in Casa Solana, she admires the beautiful flowers in the yard that bloom and thrive every year. And she thinks of the Japanese men who cultivated the once barren soil there. I always think of them, those men, she exclaimed. I think our Japanese fathers and grandfathers might be pleased with that legacy of resilience. Today, we can and must remember them and the injustices they suffered, as well as the peace and justice they wished for, through pilgrimages, both informal and informal, events, research, for only we can bring meaning to such memorials. Their legacy is in us and for us to maintain and act on. And this just gives you an example of our attempt in 2012 to mark the 10th anniversary of the historical marker. The New Mexico JCL has been receiving National Park Service grants to do a very large project called Confinement in the Land of Enchantment. And I want to invite you to an event next year around this time. On April 23rd, we intend to have a 20th anniversary event for the establishment of the historical marker. So please save the date and get in touch if you're interested. Let me close with the inscription on the Santa Fe internment camp marker itself. At this site, due east and below the hill, 4,555 men of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated in a Department of Justice internment camp from March 1942 to April 1946. Most were excluded by law from becoming United States citizens and were removed primarily from the West Coast and Hawaii. During World War II, their loyalty to the United States was questioned. Many of the men held here without due process were longtime resident religious leaders, businessmen, teachers, fishermen, farmers, and others. No person of Japanese ancestry in the US was ever charged or convicted of espionage throughout the course of the war. Many of the internees had relatives who served with distinction in the American Armed Forces in Europe and in the Pacific. This marker is placed here as a reminder that history is a valuable teacher only if we do not forget our past. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining me.
So, Dr. Okawa, how was it determined who was sent to the mainland camps and who was imprisoned on the islands? And why were the group photos taken at the camps?
And why were these group photos taken? You're talking about the photos from the Santa Fe internment camp. I believe it's because as Japanese people, they wanted to, it's a process of memorializing something. Kinen ni, the photos are taken. And it was possible at the time for them to bring up, actually, those photos were taken by a professional photographer whom they brought in. They weren't allowed to have cameras of their own, so they were able to actually have those photos taken, and many of them appeared in various family collections. As for the first question, who was sent to the mainland camps and who was imprisoned in the islands, generally speaking, I think the aliens, the Issei, who were community leaders, were so basically targeted and sent to the camps. It's a very long and involved story. And you can read it in my book, or we can talk about it at another time, because it is it was a really convoluted process as to why this particular group of men was chosen. And it had a lot to do with national politics, the military governor versus the people at the very top, like FDR and the Secretary of War and so on. So it was a very complicated story as to why certain people were selected and not others.
Great, thank you. So our next question from the audience, Dr. Okawa, what research has been conducted on intergenerational trauma?
Well, actually, I think there has been research on this, and certainly it has tended to come out of the WRA camp experience because of the fact that it was so widespread, involving thousands and thousands of people. So I think work has been done. This is not my area. And as far as I know, not very much research has been done on this topic in relation to the Hawaii Issei experience. I think this is one of the areas that does need to be studied. And I do mention that as an area for further research in my book.
We just had one more question come in from the audience from Gail. Did the gentleman who did those lovely sketches and portraits go on to pursue art professionally?
If you're talking about Mr. Hoshida, I don't believe he made it a profession, but he certainly was responsible for documenting. I think it's the only documentation we have of many of the scenes of life in the camp, as well as even the structures in the camp. And he did hundreds of portraits, as the one I showed you, of internees themselves, which can be found. The collection, the entire collection, was donated by the Hoshida family to the Japanese American National Museum. But you can also find them in different collections, at different used as illustrations in different books, such as Poets Behind Barbed Wire.
Hey, thank you so much. So that concludes our audience questions. Roslyn, did you want to make any closing remarks or anything?
Well, I just want to thank Dr. Okawa for this wonderful presentation. There's remarkable stories in here, and it's sort of a segue for people to order the book. We have a wonderful discount by the publisher, and I'll have Melissa go into that. we can get paperbacks for the $26 with the 20% off. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, so on your screen right now, you should be able to see information on ordering Dr. Okawa's book. The link that you see on the screen will also be posted on our website, just so it's easier for you to click that later. As you can see, hardback is $75, paperback at $26, and don't forget to add in that coupon code to get 20% off. Thank you to our funders, San Francisco Grants for the Arts, San Francisco Japantown Foundation, and the Henry and Tomoya Takahashi Charitable Foundation. And special thanks, of course, to Dr. Gail Okawa for her presentation today and everybody listed that you see here. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. This concludes the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.